Hello class, today we are going to look at a lot of information. I'm calling this Between the Wars 1, between the Civil War and World War I, and then there'll be another one Between the Wars 2, which looks at between World War I and World War II. So the Civil War ends in 1865. World War I is going to begin in 1914, but the U.S. will not join until 1917. And there's a lot of stuff that goes down in between. So most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today happens in between those two, or is thematically connected to what's mostly going on in between that time period. So I'm going to go a little fast. By my standards, you'll probably still find it a bit lengthy. Okay, so first I want to talk about the West. We know that the U.S. had gotten a bunch of land from our previous units, and a lot of settlers went first to places like California because that's where the coast was, that's where ocean and trade and all that stuff. And the interior of the country was kind of not left alone, but settlers walked through it and went west. And so there are still plenty of Plains Indians, but eventually American settlers come to fill in this land. And there is this conflict between the two, right? Because the Plains Indians are already there. The American settlers want to come there. And there's a conflict both philosophically as well. Right? Many American settlers view this land as unimproved, kind of left alone, natural. And so they felt like they could take it over and turn it into something. And we see that, just to take one example, the bison, right? The amount of bison goes from 65 million to 1,000 in a 90-year period. Almost goes extinct, right? This is the buffalo, the American bison. And that kind of goes to how the American settlers viewed this land. Like, we can take it over and do with it what we want, including hunting the bison, and that balance that the Plains Indians had found in hunting the bison was kind of removed. Okay? All right. We see that basically what happens is the reservations start to shrink. So originally, there was the Native Americans on the East Coast, and in the times like under President Jackson that we talked about earlier, a lot of those Native American groups were sent to the Great Plains, which was viewed as, there aren't settlers here, maybe the land isn't as good, and you guys can have the kind of Great Plains area. Of course, sending groups that had spent their whole life in a place like, let's say, Georgia, and now going to a very different landscape and trying to carve out a life for themselves. And it also meant that you had the Plains Indians that were already there being pushed aside to make way for these new Native American groups that were moving in. But eventually, even that area, right, the U.S. starts to claim and take over that Great Plains area. And so the reservations get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the conflicts between the U.S. Army trying to protect the settlers and the natives increases. And for the most part, a lot of people get moved or stuck in a new land that isn't theirs, or their reservations shrink, and it's all bad. One exception here is the Navajo. I say exception, but it's really not a full-on exception. But we talked about the Trail of Tears and how they moved people from the East Coast Native Americans to places like Oklahoma. And the U.S. government tried to do the same thing with the Navajo. The Navajo were kind of in the mountains of Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, and they tried to move them east to the east side of New Mexico, which is near Oklahoma, and that same kind of landscape, maybe like the land isn't so good, and so it's called the Long Walk for the Navajo, similar to the Trail of Tears. And they kick out all the Navajo, and it just didn't go well. There's no food and not enough stuff. The Navajo are dying. It's expensive to maintain these camps. And so eventually the government actually lets them return to their native homeland between the Four Sacred Mountains. And to this day, the Navajo have the largest reservation in the continental U.S. that by itself is bigger than many states. Not to say that they had it easy. It's still tough. They're getting super hit by COVID right now. But if we can find an exception or a silver lining, they got to go back to their homeland. And most of it was preserved between the four sacred mountains. Okay. Just to give you an example of the shrinking reservation thing, if we look at the Sioux, the Sioux signed a treaty with the U.S. government that limited their land, so they gave up claims to a bunch of land. But then the U.S. said, okay, you give up claims to a bunch of land, but this land in this treaty now is yours. It's protected. And we'll respect your boundaries on this land. It's slightly smaller than your original territory, but we'll respect it. But then what happened? Gold was found on that land, and prospectors came to get gold, and the Sioux said, no, this is our land. U.S., please enforce this treaty. Don't let people on our land. And instead, the U.S. seized some of that land that they had just signed a treaty to protect and say was the Sioux's and not the U.S.'s. Right? And eventually, 100 years later, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that the U.S. must pay the Sioux for the land that they seized, but of course the Sioux don't want to be paid. They want the land back that was seized against the treaty that they signed with the U.S. government. Okay, and as settlers are moving into the Great Plains and taking over things, we see a few things happen. One is this culture of assimilation that these Native American groups need to develop sort of a white American culture. They need to speak English and not their native language, and they need to convert to Christianity and kind of just start to be assimilated into the culture of that sort of British English culture that America was at first started with. And we see this conflict always, right? There's a question on one of the previous things, who were the nativists trying to protect? And the nativists weren't trying to protect Native Americans. They were trying to get everyone to be like your white English-speaking person, because they felt like that was what America was. And so even those that are trying to protect the natives, that want them to have rights, that want them to be treated like citizens and fellow humans, there was still this like, we're sort of fatherly to them, and so we're going to teach them a better way to live, right? I imagine that a Mr. Tower that lived in the 1800s would probably fall into this pro-native white. I'd be like, but I want you to be Christian. I want you to know Jesus, and so come to my school where I will teach you all the things that I think are better than what you know. And so that is one thing. Another thing we see here is the Dawes Act, which was basically this another way to get land. And they divided, what they said is basically, in America, everybody owns land. We carve up the land, and then you own it, and you can buy the land, and you can sell the land. And so they didn't like the idea that the natives just kind of like said, this is the land, and we all share the land and work the land and take care of the land. And so what they said is basically you have to divide the land into individual families, and each family has a plot of land. That's what we do. That's how this works, you know? Everyone just owns a piece of land. And so they made the Native Americans, let's say on a reservation, divide the land up to the individual families instead of it being owned by everyone or taken care of by everyone. And then they sold extra plots of land to settlers, and all this did was basically shrink the reservations because now they're losing more land. This is also the era of the cowboy. Okay, the cowboy is a very short-lived actual era, even though the memory of it lives long. Basically, there's the short period of time where the Great Plains had kind of been conquered by settlers, but yet the settlers hadn't carved up the land. And so we call this the open range period before the invention of barbed wire. And once there was settlers and once there was railroad lines across the Great Plains, then what happened was men would be hired to herd cattle across the plains to these railroad junctions to load into cars to then go to places like Chicago, and then from there they could be shipped out to the East Coast. So, you know, there's this brief moment where the technology allows us to ship meat across the country, and you don't have to, um, you know, go to the local farmer to get meat that's fresh and recently killed. Um, but the land is still kind of, not controlled, and so everyone just kind of brands their cattle with their own special brand, and the land is open range, and people um, take their herds through the land. They graze on the grass, get big, go to the railroad junctions, and then off to the East Coast to be sold. But eventually, people are going to carve up the land with barbed wire and fences, and they won't need to brand their animals. They can just be penned in on their own property. Okay, so eventually you get the rise of private ranches, which we see. Today cattle are not on an open range; they're on a farm. They can still be shipped, though, by railroad to large urban centers to be eaten. Okay, so let's just look at how much this and rapidly this happened. Right, for the first 250 years that settlers came to the U.S. from Europe, even before the founding of the United States, but settlers came. It took 250 years for the first 400 million acres of the continental U.S. to be taken over by Europeans, and it took 30 years for the next 400 million acres. It says acres, but it's supposed to be acres. Okay. Why is that? Let's look at some push factors and some pull factors. So some push factors here is a lot of people wanted a new start. And so it could be that the Civil War displaced people. It could be that people wanted just a second chance, or it could be that they were trying to get away from ethnic and religious repression. So, for example, there's a term called the exodusters, which is supposed to be like the exodus and dust, which was a lot of southern blacks that moved west so that they could get a new start once they were freed, and I didn't want to be stuck in this cycle of sharecropping that we saw happen afterwards. And so also, for example, the Mormons are based in Utah, but that was because they started in New York and then went to Illinois, but kept getting persecuted, so they kept working their way west until they found kind of a place where they weren't persecuted anymore. Okay, some pull factors that pulled people west was the U.S. passed a whole bunch of laws. We're not going to spend a ton of time on them, but one was the Railway Act, which basically incentivized the railroad companies to build railroads across the land, so that there would be more railroads, which is going to connect people. And then there's something called the Moral Land Grant Act, and basically there is all this land, and so what the governments did is they started giving away the land to people, and the money that they raised from selling the land to people would go to create colleges. So it was kind of like this win-win. Hey, we're a new state, we don't have a lot of people, so we'll offer cheap land to people. They'll come in, they'll buy it, and then we'll use that money to build colleges, and they'll get cheap land, and we'll get more people in our state. And they'll be educated because there's colleges. These colleges were mostly focused on what we call the practical sciences versus the liberal sciences, which we talked about at the beginning of the year. So liberal studies is going to be more like the arts. It's going to be English, literature, history, language. The practical sciences are going to be more like, how do you build something? How do you farm something? Your kind of engineering thing. So you'll see a lot of engineering schools are A&M schools, like Texas A&M, agriculture and mining, I think is what A&M stands for. And so this was to help the people learn how to do things like farm and mine and on the new land that was given away. And so actually the first example of a land grant university is Michigan State. It was the nation's first land grant university, kind of serves as a model for the other ones. Okay. All right, and then just one more law that incentivized people was the Homestead Act, 1862, which basically meant that you can see these requirements, right? If you paid $10 and you lived on the land for 5 years, and you are 21 or the head of a household. Could you imagine being the head of a household at younger than 21? But it happens, right? There are examples, even I think in our school, of people that are taking care of younger siblings that they themselves are not very old. So you build a house on the land and you get the land, right? So pay $5, or say pay $10, farm the land for 5 years, build a house, and the land is yours. Okay. Now this land, though, in the Great Plains is not necessarily the happiest for construction, right? There are not a lot of trees, not a lot of lumber, and so a lot of houses were built out of sod, right? Sod is just the ground, so you can see them cutting the grass. The roots would hold everything together, cutting the grass and the dirt into basically bricks, okay, to build houses. So here's an example of some soddies, or some houses built out of sod. They even got up to 2 stories of houses built with sod walls. Here are some more pictures. So it's a very interesting sort of lifestyle to live inside a bunch of dirt. And there's also not wood for burning. So here you can see someone collecting chips or dried manure like cow chips or buffalo chips to burn as well. Okay, so kind of an interesting situation. Okay. Another movement that we see with this western land is the U.S. government actually taking control of it and setting aside land for things like national parks. So we get the first national park, Yellowstone, in 1872. 1879, the U.S. government actually takes back some of that land from the railroads. But by 1890, it's all over. The U.S. government declares that the frontier is at an end. The continental U.S. has been settled, 1890. Okay? So now that we have all this new settlers on this land in the middle of the country, we get a new movement called populism. We're just going to talk about populism briefly. And basically, we now have all these farmers that are in the Midwest and the West, not west by like California, but west like Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska. And they're this new demographic, or this new group, right? Before, there wasn't this group. When you looked at America, it was kind of north versus south. And now there's a new group, the group on the west. And they want their own say in the political life of the United States. And there's a lot of things going on that aren't happening on the East Coast. There isn't water, there isn't trees, there's drought, there's fire, there's insects ruining their crops, debts, railroad price inequalities. It's really expensive to ship all the stuff that they made to the East Coast to sell. And there was a depression, the Panic of 1893, and all sorts of stuff. And so they also wanted to say it wasn't just north for south anymore. They wanted the government to pass laws that would help them too, just like everyone else wants the government to pass laws to help them. So just to show you an example of what happened in 1893, you can see the price of cotton goes from $15 in 1870. 1894, it's only $5.80. So that was a big depression, and that made it really hard for people living in the Great Plains to make a living. Okay, there's all sorts of other stuff going on, and basically populism is this movement to put pressure on the federal government to fix the problems that are happening in the Great Plains. Okay, and we get the Populist Party, new political party that's going to try to get the government to pass things that are going to help those farmers out. So there's some farmers. Okay, and what are the kind of things that they wanted? Let's go through the list. 8-hour workday, popular election of senators, secret ballot, so that people didn't know who you vote for, so you have privacy in your voting. You can vote for whoever you want, right? That's kind of a key American idea we think of. Increased money supply, graduated income tax, which means that poor people pay even a smaller percentage. They don't just pay less because they're poor, but they pay a smaller percentage of their income in taxes. They wanted loans available for farmers, a single term for president, government ownership of transportation, because the railroads were jacking up prices, and if you're in the Great Plains and there's only one railroad line, you have to go with that railroad line to ship your crops or your cattle. And so if the railroad line is charging whatever they want, that means you're going to lose out. You're going to pay way too much in shipping. And so they wanted the government to control the price that the railroads could charge by either taking control of the railroads or making the railroads charge a fixed rate instead of jacking up prices. So a lot of these things we consider good, like the 8-hour workday, the secret ballot. popular election of senators. These things all ended up happening. Things like single term for president did not, though. Okay. There's also something really important to populists that we're not going to spend a ton of time on. That's the bimetallic standard, but I'm going to talk about it briefly in a second. Okay. The Populists is actually a short-lived political party because basically what happens is the Democrats and the Populists are very similar. In fact, the Democrats and Populists in 1896 nominated the same person for president, even though they were different political parties, but different vice presidents in the nomination. But that person, William Jennings Bryan, lost to McKinley in the election of 1896. And eventually the Populist Party dies and just joins the Democrats. Okay, but here's a quote from their political candidate, who was important for a long time in U.S. history. If you guys were doing your decades project on the 1890s, the 1900s, this guy, William Jennings Bryan, would be a good pick for a person. Okay, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. Okay, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold is a famous quote of him that goes back to that bimetallic standard that I'll try to mention briefly. So here's just kind of an image of him that's kind of played up. Here's that cross of gold from the quote and the crown of thorns. And here's kind of a thing representing the election of him. People trying to get him elected, right? A little political pin sort of thing. Okay. It wasn't all political parties. There was also two groups and more, but the National Grange and the Farmers Alliance were just groups that tried to operate collectively and cooperatively to help farmers out by doing things like lobbying the government, like everyone else, lobby the government to make changes that help them, buying in bulk to get better prices, etc. Okay, here's an image of the National Grain. Here's an image of Farmers Alliance picnic. Okay, so populism is best remembered from The Wizard of Oz. A lot of people view The Wizard of Oz as basically an allegory of populism. And so basically trying to make a comparison or put in a hidden message about populists and what they think and what is good for America through this story. Okay. So a lot of people think that Dorothy sitting there in Kansas and the tornado represents sort of the average Midwesterner, and we see that there's the scarecrow is like the farmers, and the Tin Man is the workers, and the lion is the good politicians, and then the Wicked Witch of the East and the Wicked Witch of the West represent those East Coast and West Coast people that have different ideas and are trying to pass laws that are beneficial to them and not to the farmers. Okay, and the Yellow Brick Road is connected to this bimetallic standard. So one thing that was really important is they wanted gold and silver to play a role in money. It's kind of complicated instead of just gold, because they thought that that would mean there was more money, which would make it easier for the kind of things that the farmers were trying to do. Like, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it'd be easier to get loans and for prices to not go out of whack. And they were hoping that it would bring in higher farm prices. And so in the book, it's actually silver slippers, not ruby slippers. And so they were saying, hey, we need to bring silver in addition to gold into this money standard, bimetallic, right? Both metals need to play a role in the U.S. money supply. Okay, kind of a complicated issue that's not important anymore. Okay, so the Wizard, the Emerald City, all these things play a role. Okay, all right, so next topic is the Industrial Revolution. We already talked about how the Industrial Revolution changes America and the world, and we see how through the 1800s people move from the country to the cities. We get all these new inventions that mean that there's all sorts of things that can happen now that couldn't happen before, and we talked about the cycle of how more inventions means more time to do other things other than just farm, which leads to more inventions, which leads to more time, more inventions, more time. So it's a whole new world at the end of the 1800s here. We have railroads springing up all the place. We have this people found a use for oil, and all of a sudden oil becomes super important. And we get things like the telephone and the light bulb that are going to change the world and change America. So oil, electricity comes, the telegraph, and eventually the telephone for communication across large distances rapidly. The railroad means that you can cross the country much faster. Goods can be traveled much faster now, right? You can raise your cattle in, let's say, North Texas, and some guy on the East Coast can eat it. Okay. Oh yeah, here is the railroad connecting the first railroad to connect the West Coast and the East Coast. Here's the Golden Spike that they're nailing in at the point of connection, which was in Utah. Okay. The Bessemer process made what was a rare metal, steel, much cheaper and faster to produce, which is basically steel is just iron that's treated with other things to make it even stronger. And so once you get steel being super cheap, now you get skyscrapers and bridges and all sorts of fancy things, okay? And it just continues. It just keeps coming. Typewriter, cars, airplanes, toilets, paper, jeans, zippers, on and on it goes. Okay, so one of the big things that we see in this industrial revolution is that businesses just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Before the industrial revolution, everything was a mom and pop shop, and then now you can have a country, not a country, but you can have a company that is as big as a country, right? Employs hundreds of thousands of people in the same company. Okay. And so that's kind of the big thing that we see. We see the rise of things like oligopolies and monopolies, where only one or a few companies makes that entire thing. So it's not like, okay, look, there's a shoemaker, on this corner of the street, and then if you go 4 blocks down, there's another shoemaker, and if you go 4 more blocks down the street, there's another shoemaker. Now you have a thing where there's only a few companies that are making one product or producing one product. And so, for example, electricity is this new thing, but now, you get an electric company that sets up shop, and maybe they're the only ones that can provide electricity in that city, because they're the ones that were able to get the money and the loan to build the big plant needed to generate the electricity. But now, if they're the only ones that offer electricity, can they charge whatever price they want, or should the government try to control those prices, or what, right? And so we see that companies are constantly trying to get bigger so that they can drive out competitors, and there's this pushback, like, should the government try to prevent that from happening or not, which continues to this day. For example, right, T-Mobile just took over Sprint, and there was questions like, should the government let them do that so that there's even less wireless carriers for your cell phone or not? Okay. Now that there's fewer bigger companies, you get branding as being really important. Branding, mass marketing. You get the rise of the department stores like Macy's and Marshall Fields. And so, now you can look at something like, let's say, a Kellogg's box, and you see that Kellogg's K, and you probably know, hey, that's Kellogg's K. Or you see GM, and oh, GM, General Motors, right? But that's because they're producing now cereal, Kellogg's, right, that can be found all over the country. And so that couldn't have existed before the Industrial Revolution. But now it becomes really important that, hey, when you look at that symbol, you can recognize it. Anywhere in the country, you see that fancy K, and you're like, I know that's Kellogg's K. Okay? Or I know that apple with a bite out of it, that is an Apple product, right? And it becomes important to recognize the brands now that companies are getting bigger. Okay, and we can see that technology is skyrocketing. This is a graph of patents in the U.S., and so the number of patents in the U.S., you can see, just keeps going up and up and up, starting in the 1850s, and this graph ends in like 2005, I think. And so you can see there's even more. The Industrial Revolution just keeps going up and up. Think about it. More time, more inventions, more time, more inventions. The cycle that we talked about. Okay? But you can see it kind of begins here in this time period that we're trying to talk about here. We see this upward growth of patents. Okay? And we see new players on the field. So, for example, Andrew Carnegie gets really rich off of steel. and here is some steel factories, and he becomes extremely wealthy. And so there's a lot of questions about, is this good or is this bad or whatnot, right? That he's making all this money. Now, he did use some of his money for others. So, for example, he built a ton of libraries all over the United States. This is one example of a Carnegie Library, which is in Ann Arbor. And so he uses money for a lot of things, but a lot of people feel like, was that worth it? Here he's doing some good work with medicine, etc. Rockefeller does the same thing, except with oil instead of steel, making tons and tons of money off of oil. So much so that there's these political cartoons that show him as a king, or as this octopus that's taking over everything, and has the government, right? You can see the octopus's tentacles are around the government, has the government in his pocket, so to speak. And these are other bigwigs that are on the scene that are making tons of money. J.P. Morgan, right? Morgan still exists today as a company. Vanderbilt, Westinghouse, and Pullman make tons of money off of railroads, and their names still exist on things. Vanderbilt University, for example. Okay. All right, now let's talk about the workers at this time, right? There's this big whole shift in how things happen in the country, and it begins with lots of new people. Okay, 14 million immigrants come to America between 1860 and 1900, plus 8 to 9 million people move from farms to cities because of things like drought. So all of a sudden there are millions and millions and millions of new people in the cities, because most immigrants are going to start in the city, and most will stay. Some will move, out west to try to make a start out there. So there's millions and millions of new workers. And a lot of them are new. They don't speak English. For example, in 1900, 1/3 of the U.S. workers were foreign born. And we see it's not just people coming from outside the U.S. or people coming from farms to the cities. So, for example, in Chicago, 80% of the African workers in Chicago were born south of Illinois, and people were moving to the cities to get a new start. So the African Americans were moving from the south to the north to places like Chicago to try to get a new start. And a lot of the workers were also young. So you can see that over 1/4 of boys, 10 to 15, work in the labor force. And I think it's on a later slide, but we'll see that girls actually, in a sense, make up more of the labor force than boys, because what happens is families would try to keep their boys in school as long as possible so that they had a chance at getting a better education and getting a better job because of it. And so if the family was desperate for money and it was a choice between, does the boy drop out of school and go to work, or does the girl drop out of school and go to work, the girl dropped out of school and went to work so that the boy could stay in school and try to get ahead. Okay, so now lots and millions of people are working in factories, and they weren't before. And factory work was not very nice. There's been a lot of changes in the rules, and at this time it was pretty rough. So you can see most work 12-hour days, 6 days a week. That is low wages, poor working conditions. A lot of people were paid what we call piecemeal or piecework, which means that they were only paid based on how many of a part they made, not hourly. They didn't make so many dollars an hour. So let's say that you were slower or disabled in some way. Maybe you couldn't work as fast, so you weren't paid as much. And managers could be quite cruel, right? You could be fired for being late, for talking, for refusing to do a task. These places were often terrible working conditions, not just noisy, poor lighting, ventilation, frequent fires, accidents. Just to give you one example, in 1881, 30,000 railroad workers are killed or injured on the job, and that's true all over the place. And with millions of workers, hey, if you're injured, then, we'll just hire someone else, because there's a lot of people that want to work, right? There's millions of people looking for jobs. So you're injured, you're slow, you're out, we'll bring in someone fresh, and now you no longer have a job, and it's going to be hard to get one because you're injured, right? It's going to be hard to take care of yourself. Okay? But what keeps happening is there's also technology, there's also inventions, and so as things get more efficient, then workers are laid off because they're not needed because the machine can do more of the work. And everything becomes done in the name of efficiency. If a machine can do it better than a human, of course we're going to have the machine. Or if it's better for one human to, let's say you're trying to build a car, right? And let's say there's 100 parts. So one way that you could do it is you could have one person assemble the 100 parts and build the car. Another way that you could do it is that you could have 100 workers and they each do assemble one part. And that's much more efficient to do it that way. To just have each worker do one part over and over and over again, right? And so workers would often do one task over and over again instead of seeing a product from start to finish, which is really efficient, but it often took the joy out of work, create boredom, create health problems if you're doing the same motion thousands of times a day, 6 days a week for years on end. And so basically the humans were cogs in the machine of producing goods, and the more efficient the system, the more money to be made. Okay, so not a lot of interaction between boss and worker unless things didn't go well, right? There was the kind of this mindset that workers were tools, which is kind of what I was trying to say here. Okay, here's some pictures. Okay, there's some textile mill. Here's some workers at the machine that are children. Here's some more children at work. Okay, so let's just talk about it briefly. Right, there was plenty of child laborers. Probably 1 in 5 children worked in general, and this was because they needed to. Families relied on their income, and is it 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4, something like that? So often, this is the late 1800s, so school now exists, right? School is the thing. We talked about how schools appear in the mid 1800s, which is great. But when we think of schools, it's often elementary school, right? And so high school was kind of a voluntary thing or didn't exist at this point. So most people left school at 12 or 13 to go work. Okay, so right now, right, you're about to graduate from middle school. It's time to go into the workforce, right, if you lived in this time period. Okay, and again, often the girls would go into the workforce so the boys could stay in school and try to go to high school and go get an education. Okay. Eventually, though, there is this movement to crack down on child labor, and because this number, right, 1 in 5 would have been much higher even 40 years before the time period we're talking. And eventually you get laws in place that say, hey, you can't leave school, right? You can't drop out of school, or you're only allowed to work, like if you're in high school, you can only work so many hours at a job at certain times and stuff like this. There was this general mindset that comes through this whole period, and we can see how the workers were treated, which is, we can just summarize as social Darwinism. So Darwin comes on the scene in the 1860s with his theory of natural selection, which we've covered in science, and there was this movement to apply it to society, right? That those that are better suited to survive will survive, and the other ones will die. We saw that. That's Darwinism, but that's just in nature to describe how a trait appears. But people applied it to society. The strong will survive. And so social Darwinists had this idea that government should stay out of business and just let kind of nature take over, right? Those that are better are going to become successful and rich, and those that are not are going to be weeded out or not have good jobs. So there was this kind of push for this idea to apply Darwinism to society, which is kind of problematic. And so there's all sorts of questions that come out of this time period, like what role should the government do? Should the government be trying to make sure factories are safe or not safe? Is America supposed to be a land for, Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller? Or how do we, Andrew Carnegie started off as a very poor man, and he worked his way up by his bootstraps to become like the wealthiest man in the world for a short period of time. And so, right, how do we balance all of these things? Okay. And so let's just talk about some numbers just for fun here. So 1890, 10% of the population had 75% of the wealth. That hasn't really changed by 2007. 10% of the population holds 73% of the wealth. It's about the same. But if you break it down even further, you can see some interesting trends. So in 2007, 1% of the population held a third of the wealth in the U.S. And if you look at 2017, the bottom half of America, the bottom 160 million people, the 160 million poorest people have as much wealth as the top 3 people in America. Okay, so we see that capitalism creates a lot of money and a lot of wealth, but it creates it unequally. And there's this question over, should the government do something about the fact that wealth is being created unequally, or is that not the government's role? Okay, so let's just look. Here is a nice mansion of a wealthy industrial leader. And here are some tenement homes where poor immigrant workers or poor workers would live. So I'm just going to, there'll be more pictures, don't worry. So the workers are going to strike back against this by forming unions where they want to do a few different things. They want to collectively bargain. So collectively bargain means they're all going to try to collectively are all fight for their rights, their wages, the conditions of work. They want to bargain for those things with the employees, with the bosses, collectively, so that maybe one worker by himself, has nothing against a big boss. He can just say, I'm going to hire someone else. But if all of the workers work together and say, no, we're all not going to work unless you pay us this wage or make this condition safe, then now they have some leverage to work with these rich owners. Okay, their other leverage, right, is to go on strike or sit-in, which Flint is famous for, the auto sit-ins, where they refuse to work to try to get the rights that they think that they need, because they figure if the boss is losing money because people aren't working, then they have some leverage. Okay, so this creates a lot of conflict between industrial leaders and the workers, and there's a lot of conflict between the groups. Some people try to go further than this philosophically, and we see in this time period as the Industrial Revolution is taking off and the inequality gaps are growing, that some people think that the system is good but needs to be just controlled. Like maybe the government passes laws saying, oh, you have to pay your workers this much, or you have to have things like fire extinguishers to make it safe. But some people start to push for government control of the businesses so that there aren't private wealthy people that are making all this money. And so they want the government to control everything, to try to make business fair, and to distribute the wealth equally instead of unequally to people. And those movements are things like socialism and communism. And so some people at this time make this big push to try to actually create a whole new system of doing things. But of course, this is going to be viewed as a threat, because if you are a rich industrial leader, they're saying, hey, we don't want you to own your factory anymore. But even if you're a government person, you're saying, hey, we want a new government that's going to take control of all these things. So they're both going to feel threatened by socialism and communism. Okay, in America, probably the most famous socialist is Eugene V. Debs. We're not going to talk about him, but he's probably the most famous one in America. Okay, and so this conflict between workers and industrial leaders leads to lots of things, including lots of strikes and lots of deaths and lots of things. So just one example is what we call the Great Upheaval of 1886, where there was 1,500 strikes of more than 400,000 workers. But the president at the time, Cleveland, generally sided with the business owners on dealing with these disputes. We'll see that other presidents have different priorities. For example, Teddy Roosevelt was famous for what we call the square deal, where he tried to make a deal that seemed square to him or fair between some mine workers and mine owners, where neither of them got what they wanted, but they kind of got something in the middle. Okay, and a prime example of how dangerous these factories were was something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which was in 1911 and kind of rocked the country. And basically it was where the company locked all their doors but one to prevent theft, and then of course there was a fire. The fire blocked the unlocked door. The one fire escape collapsed. This was a multi-story factory. The fire department's ladders couldn't reach because it was too high up, and basically a bunch of people in the factory died. Okay, so uh, right, the ladders can't reach. A lot of people died, and so there was a lot of questions that people raised about should the government try to do something about this, right? Should the company be found guilty of manslaughter? Should there be regulations about things like you have to have unlocked doors, you have to have fire escapes, you have to have fire extinguishers or whatever? And so a lot of those building codes come from things like this. Okay, so far we can see that America is rapidly changing. At the end of the frontier age, America is huge, both number of people and size of the country. Technology is changing rapidly and uniting this vast nation. The Industrial Revolution is changing how people's lives are lived and run. But there's all sorts of new conflicts now. What is good? What is bad? Is there a middle ground between the city and the country, between the business and the worker, between the middle of America and the coasts, between the immigrants and the people that were already here? And what role does the government play in all of this? Should they be trying to control things or letting things run their course? And so there's all sorts of issues. So if we look here at immigration, we're just going to touch briefly on immigration here. This is a quote from Walt Whitman, famous poet from the time period. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. That kind of describes America in a nutshell. Okay, so a lot of immigrants come because they want new opportunities. They want to get away from persecution, famines, shortage of land in places like Europe. So there's lots of reasons for them to come, and they come to America looking for a new start. So just for example, Jews being massacred in Russia would be a reason that a lot of Jews would move to America. Okay. All right, so how many people are moving? Lots of people. Between 1865 and 1890, 10 million immigrants arrived, most from Northwest and Central Europe, but then it starts to shift in the 1890s. Now they're starting to come from Eastern and Southern Europe, starting to come from the Middle East. And it's estimated that by 1920, between 1865 and 1920, close to 30 million people, right? So that means that it's 20 million people between 1890 and 1920. That's a lot of people entering the U.S., okay? Most immigrants came through Ellis Island in New York City, but there were other places, Seattle, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, which we'll talk about. Some people came for a short amount of time to work, make some money, and return home, but most people came to stay. So here's some immigrants on a ship, although ships, it was all about price, right? So the cheaper ones were below deck, and you are in very cramped corners in the bottom of the ship. So only the more expensive immigrants could be up on the top. Okay, here's immigrants in line. Okay, here's a bad picture of Ellis Island. Okay, here is the life that some immigrants lived, what it was like. Due to kind of a double pressure. One, the fact that there was discrimination against immigrants, and two, the fact that immigrants often wanted to live near other immigrants, get worked into a community that spoke the same language and things like that. We got the development of ghettos where often immigrants lived in the same place that spoke the same language, shared the same culture. So part of that was a positive, like, hey, I'm going to live with a bunch of Italians so that I can get worked into the Italian community and find people that speak my language. But some of it was discriminatory. There was things like restrictive covenants, which prevented people from selling to, let's say, immigrants or blacks. And so there was these racial discriminations where certain neighborhoods people weren't allowed to move into. Okay? All right, let's look at some pictures. Baseball. Yeah, try using that toilet. Okay, so conditions are pretty bad in the tenements, like we saw, which are these buildings that housed people on the cheap, so the poorest people are going to live in them. Basically, there is a lack of light, air, and clean water in these places, and so there was a movement to improve these things and provide these things. So, for example, there's a dumbbell shape. I'll show you a picture of it in a second, which meant that there had to be a window. It was designed so that there would be a window in every room, so that there could be light And so eventually they started adding chlorine to the water to make it safer to drink, which they still add chlorine to the water today. We talked at the beginning of this epidemic about how there was a cholera epidemic in the or pandemic in the 1800s linked to bad drinking water. Okay, we see outhouses being replaced with hallway bathrooms and stuff like that. So here's a picture of that dumbbell shape. So a dumbbell shape is a building design so that there should be a window to let in light so that you don't have these rooms with no light. It's a weird concept, but think about if there's no light bulbs and no windows, it's going to be pretty dark. And if you're using a lamp, it's going to get soot everywhere. So this shape still means that you're using most of the land for building space, but the shape allows there to be windows in between the buildings. Okay, you can see there's not a lot of space between buildings, but at least you're getting some light. Okay, so if Ellis Island was the immigration station on the east coast, Angel Island was the main immigration station on the west coast, and that's where the Chinese immigrants, pictured here, would come through. And the Chinese were the most discriminated group, or most excluded group of all the immigrants. In fact, in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The act prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country, and it was not repealed until 1943. So basically, this was the group that was most excluded of all of the races from entering America for a long period of time. Okay, the ones that were able to come often worked by themselves in groups, doing jobs that no one wanted to do for less money. For example, building the railroads. Okay, a similar story is true for the Japanese, and so they weren't as discriminated or restricted from entering the country as the Chinese, but it still wasn't all great for them. Okay, and here's a picture of some Japanese immigrants. But they were discriminated. For example, San Francisco School District said that the Japanese had to go to separate schools, which caused quite the uproar at the time. Okay, so we also have immigrants coming from Mexico. Don't want to forget them. And so all of this land in the southwest is now being converted into farmland by irrigation, taking the Colorado River, the Rio Grande, and irrigating the fields near them. So instead of desert, now there's farmland, which means there's workers. And we see a lot of people come from Mexico fleeing the Mexican Revolution, looking for better conditions. Okay. But immigration caused a lot of conflict. A lot of people didn't want an immigrant to come, compete for jobs, etc. with them. And you can see that represented here in a couple comics, right? So here saying, hey, pass this literacy test, which is like a wall to protect America made of books to keep the immigrants out. Okay. And because this congressman wanted a literacy test for all immigrants. And here's another way, which is to do a percentage and say that only so many people are allowed to enter the country to try to slow down the rate of immigration. So immigrants and people from the country are all moving to the cities, and cities are being transformed not just by the sheer number of people, but by things like light bulbs, steel allowing skyscrapers, and mass transit allowing subways, trolleys, elevated trains to move people through the cities. And one of the big things that we happen is cities start to come up with master plans and designs for how they should look, and those master plans and designs still play a role today. So one of the most famous designers was Frederick Olmsted, and he designed Central Park in New York, Belle Isle in Detroit, and many others. And Burnham's plan for Chicago still reflects in its design today. So here's Central Park, which really stands out. Everyone recognizes it for the most part. Like, boom, there in New York, you got Central Park. And there used to be buildings here, right? But they got rid of them all to build this park, tore down poor houses and stuff like that, and to make this landmark. He also designed Belle Isle, which is in Detroit. Okay, so here you can see Belle Isle as well, which was designed by him. Okay, here's the plan for Chicago. And many of these things have changed, but a lot of them are still reflected in many ways in the design of Chicago. So having this plan design for a city was this big thing. Okay, but growing cities were hard. There was tons of people, and it was difficult to govern. It was difficult to control. There was sewage and disease and all sorts of stuff. And so cities started to become much more powerful politically. Mayors and stuff had important roles to play in American politics, etc. And we see the rise of the political machine, okay, which is basically all of the corruption and briberies that went on to keep cities running. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but these political bosses of big cities like a New York or a Boston had a lot of power, and a lot of it wasn't like the elected mayor. It was like the person who ran the political party that got the mayor elected held a ton of hidden power that was run by a lot of bribery and corruption. Okay. In fact, between the scandals that occurred at the federal level that we haven't talked about, and in the city, Mark Twain, the famous author, called this the Gilded Age, right? Gilded meaning something is gilded with a thin layer, covered in a thin layer of gold, covering all the poverty and corruption of the time. So here you have an example of, oh, look at how successful America is. But that's just the thin gild covering a tough, difficult world for most people. So we spent a lot of time talking about the civil rights movement, but I just want to briefly touch about Jim Crow. So here are some pictures kind of showing what life was like. Here's one of them just a little bit bigger. Right, we wash for white people only. And so life was not good under Jim Crow for the African Americans in the South. Here's just a comic showing, right, the white taking the escalator to the voters' booth, and the black trying to navigate literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, the KKK, etc. Okay. Here's just a graph showing which states used what method to try to block voting. So it could be a poll tax where you have to pay, or a literacy test that you have to pass, or if you have to own property, or the grandfather clause, which said, right, that if your ancestors could vote, then you don't have to go through any of these other things to be able to vote. But of course, if your ancestor was a slave, then they couldn't vote, so you're going to have to jump through these hurdles. But most white people would have had grandfathers, so to speak, or parents that could vote, and so they wouldn't have to jump through these hurdles. Okay. All right, and violence was really high too. So we're talking about this time period with there's a lot of violence from the KKK, the Klan, Jim Crow laws, lots of lynchings, etc. This time, right? This is a lot of, racially motivated attacks right here in this graph. Okay. All right, we mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson, but I just want to briefly mention it again because it happens in this time period. This is where the Supreme Court establishes that separate but equal was okay, which eventually, will be struck down by Brown versus Board of Education. But there it is. Okay, so a lot of black Americans were trying to figure out how to play a role in this new society, and they had a few different approaches. So one famous guy from this time is Booker T. Washington, and he was very successful in getting sort of whites to work with him. I think he got President Roosevelt to let him into the White House and things like this. But his kind of theory was that African Americans try to do it their own way, start their own companies, start their own schools and colleges, achieve their own economic independence, and then once that they were economically independent, then they would be viewed as kind of equals and integrated into the rest of society. That was kind of his approach. Another guy was Webb Du Bois, and his approach was like, no, the amendments are right there. We are equal citizens already, so we deserve and need to achieve those civil rights now, and we need to like not take an approach that is going to be wishy-washy, or an approach that is going to here's a picture of him. Okay, that means that we'll temporarily accept inequality, and eventually the white people will kind of come around. He didn't like that approach, and said that there was never a need to wait, right? Because we are Americans and we have rights, and we need to fight for those. Okay. All right. So this time period saw all sorts of crazy things. Transatlantic cable means communication can now happen across the ocean without a ship. We see the rise of the department store, modern tennis, roller coaster, bicycle, Coca-Cola, the Sears catalog. I know Sears is now on its way out, but at the time, this idea of being able to order stuff out of a catalog was crazy. The Kodak camera, shopping center, Ferris wheel. Okay. And just to show you how much America was changing, here's some more facts. Okay, the U.S. population doubled from 1870 to 1900. Economic production didn't double. It went up 800%. Cities are exploding with growth. Immigrants are pouring into America. The economy that was once dominated by family farms is now being replaced by large-scale factories and huge corporations and companies. And so there was a lot of conflict between groups, and one group that rises in power temporarily is the progressives. And the progressive solution is an expanded role for government. So the government is going to do more regulations and more social welfare programs to control things, right? So if the government can say, hey, factory, your conditions have to be safe. You have to pay your workers this much, and you can only make them work 8-hour days or 10-hour days instead of 12-hour days, or you have to give them a day off, or you have to give them a break. If they put that into the laws, they felt they could make the country better, right, and make people's lives better. So it was the government could take over and kind of help people out. Now, most progressives were kind of moderates, and we see that there was progressive presidents that were both Republican and Democrat, and they kind of were like, we want to help, we want change, but we don't want crazy change, right? They didn't want to lose the very things that they were living off of, okay? So it was more like, instead of shaking up the system, let's free the system of corruption and bring more power to the people. So they had all sorts of things they wanted to do that mainly involved the government playing a larger role in things like programs to help people. Like if you're in an accident in a factory, you're not just out on the street, but the government's going to help you. If you're unemployed, the government's going to help you, etc., etc. Okay, so let's look at it on 3 levels. The first level is municipal. That means city level. So things that happened is cities took over things like utilities, like water and gas, electricity, and this meant that they could control the prices. If a private company is doing it, they want to do it to make money. But if the city is doing it, then they could, in theory, control the price and offer a fair price for everyone for something that is considered important, like drinking water. Okay. And another thing that they did is provide welfare services. Detroit and Toledo, 2 cities close to us, are an example of where mayors tried to do things to help people, like offer free kindergarten, houses to homeless, etc. Okay. Now at the state level, it was about giving more power to the people. So we see direct primaries where the citizens actually nominate the candidates instead of political parties. By 1916, all but 3 states had them, and today we still nominate who we want to run for office. We get the 17th Amendment, which allows voters to select the senators that go to the U.S. Senate. Instead of the state government choosing, now the people get to vote. So it's all about giving power to the people. Okay. States also try to do things to make working conditions better by creating labor departments that tried to pass laws and enforce things that were going to make things safe, providing accident insurance, compensation for injury, and all sorts of things. Okay. At the federal level, we see other things as well. For example, there was an act on the book called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was going to break up big companies, but no one enforced it for like 16 years. This law was on the books and no one used it. And now they're going to start to break up big companies to prevent them from having a monopoly and bullying other companies around and controlling prices. We see something called the Interstate Commerce Commission, if you remember from the roles of government. The federal government can control commerce between the states, And so they started to do things like regulate railroad rates so that they would be maybe more fair or just and couldn't just be jacked up to make money for the company. Okay. So the most famous antitrust case was Standard Oil versus the U.S. Standard Oil was that Rockefeller company, and it was big and it was powerful and it had lots of money, and the government made it break into smaller companies. So companies that you know today, like ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron. Well, BP is British Petroleum, but that's because they bought part of what used to be Standard Oil, and so they made them break apart into smaller companies. Okay. Another thing that the feds did in this time is protect the land. We get the Forestry Service, we get the National Park Service. President Roosevelt set aside more than 200 million acres, and now if you look at this map, you can see in pink the national parks and in green the national forests. So much land is now protected by the federal government. The idea being that then all Americans can access this land, and it can be a gift to all Americans and not owned by someone. We also see things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act to make sure that what is inside of food is accurate and safe. There's a famous book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which talked about just how gross the stuff that was going into meat was, etc. And so this is to try to do things like create nutrition facts and make sure that food is safe. Okay, we get the Children's Bureau, the Women's Bureau that are passing laws to help women and children. The 16th Amendment gives the government the power to collect income tax, which meant that government can now pay for a lot more stuff. We don't like our income taxes, but now they can pay for a lot more stuff and pay for a lot of these new programs. We get the 18th Amendment that banned alcohol, which was a big social push to try to make life better. So here they are dumping the alcohol. Here's a pretty pixelated picture about, this mother protecting her child from evil liquor. And here we can see the problems that liquor causes and why they wanted to get rid of alcohol. Right? They felt that alcohol caused defiance in laws, trafficking in girls. Right? So basically slavery, prostitution, political corruption, partnership with thieves, gambling. It was all kind of tied together because of alcohol. So they got rid of it, of course, for a temporary amount of time. Women also get the right to vote. So these are all sort of the progressive ideas of the government getting more involved in trying to do things to help people. But there's always this conflict between, is that the role of government or is that not the role of government? Okay. It's not just in government. There's a bunch of organizations that spring up to try to help people at this time that have that sort of progressive mentality, but we're just not government organizations. Okay, and two of the big presidents at this time were Teddy Roosevelt, who is also famous for his imperialistic ambitions, but we already saw a video on that, who was a Republican president, and then Wilson, who was your quintessential Democratic progressive president, except for his extremely racist views. This time period also is a time period of new things. Sports leagues spring up. Now that Americans aren't just working on the farm, but now they can listen to the radio, they're living in cities, and they can take the trolley or the elevated train into town to a stadium. Now people can actually watch sporting events or listen to them on the radio. So sports spring up in ways that they didn't exist before. Like people played sports, but people didn't watch sports in the same way. And now they can watch big league teams and sports leagues spring up. Okay, all coming out of this time period. So here is Chicago versus Detroit in the World Series, and man, it would take a while for both those guys to go back to the World Series. Okay, we already watched the video on imperialism, but I just wanted to show one slide to show even now, right? This is from 2002. Basically, if it's in pink, then the U.S. has troops in that country, and you can see the U.S. has troops in most countries around the world. So the U.S. has found ways to make sure its interests in the form of troops exist all over the world. Okay. If it's in pink, if it's in dark pink, then it's actually a U.S. military base in that country. And that will do it. Next video will be on World War I.